Welcome to the Art Elevator. I'm your host, Larissa Wild. Join me on this weekly podcast as I dig deep interviewing art historians, curators, appraisers, artists, and more to bring you lifetimes of knowledge in a digestible format to elevate your knowledge of art. Welcome to this week's episode of the Art Elevator. Today we're going to do a shop talk with appraisers, and I have Sarah Reeder here with me today. Hi Sarah, how are you?
Fine, thanks. Hi Larissa.
So here's a scenario. You might be told that you need an appraisal for your art collection. Maybe your insurance agent told you this. Maybe your attorney told you this, or your accountant. How do you find the right appraiser, and what on earth is going to be in this so-called appraisal? So Sarah, when you get the call and somebody tells you that they need an appraisal done, what are your first questions? What are the first steps you're going to take with somebody?
Sure. And these are questions that I get a lot. It's very common that someone's insurance agent or their lawyer says, you need to get an appraisal on your art collection. But if you've never actually had an appraisal performed before, you don't know the first thing about where to start. And so just even to reach someone like you or I to call us, I would definitely recommend to your listeners to research appraisers who are members of one of the three major professional organizations in America and Canada. And those are the ISA, International Society of Appraisers, the AAA, Appraisers Association of America, and ASA, the American Society of Appraisers. And all three of those professional organizations require their members to be USPAP compliant, which is really, really important. And USPAP stands for Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. And the way I explain it to clients, it's a very long book and an exam that boils down to saying appraisers pledge to not be unethical, which is something we all want, right? So I would definitely, for people who've been told you need an appraisal, I would start searching the websites of those professional organizations and their databases to see if there's an appraiser near you who is appropriately qualified in the type of artwork or other object that you have, and to make sure that they're USPAP compliant. And so that is the very first step. And then you can start contacting them, making some calls, checking out their websites and emailing them.
Brilliant. And so the term USPAP, some people might be familiar with that because it's also overseeing real property appraisals. So you may have heard of that from buying a property. So it's similar, but there are obviously differences. But they both oversee the methodology that means that you're getting an appraisal that is correctly done according to methodology.
Yes, and also that the appraiser can't have a vested interest in the property that is being appraised. Every appraisal report that I prepare and that you prepare has a what's called a USPAP certification in it, and it's a long statement, but the part that I think is really critical for anyone who is going to be having an appraisal performed in the future to look for is that the appraiser is pledging they have no past, present, or future interest in the objects they're appraising, because back in the day, this sometimes happened, which led to scenarios where sometimes the client's best interests weren't represented. So appraisers need to be impartial and objective. And that's why appraisers charge, project rate and hourly rate, something that has no relationship with whatever the final appraised value will be.
Yes, that is very important, that you're not being charged a percentage of the value, because there's an obvious conflict there. And so, Sarah, when you said somebody who is competent or qualified to appraise that type of object, talk a little more about that so people can understand what that means.
Certainly. Well, I like to think of it in a metaphor like doctors. You know, if you need a heart doctor, you're not going to go to a foot doctor. So it's sort of the same thing for appraisers. You know, there are many, many different specializations for the art and antique world, and some of them are very obscure. And so it's always a good idea to find the best fit for your objects. And some appraisers, like in my firm, I'm actually a generalist, so I appraise art and I appraise other items as well. To be a qualified appraiser, and this is also part of USPAP and competency, we have to be competent, i.e. appropriately qualified with specialized connoisseurship knowledge to appraise the items that we've agreed to appraise. And so finding out who's the best fit for what your objects are, and narrowing it down to that group of appraisers to reach out to see who you have the best chemistry with, that's always a great strategy. And speaking for myself and many of my colleagues, I know you do this too, if we're not the right fit, I always try to direct someone to a colleague who is the right fit, because it's a big field of all of us, and somebody out there probably has the expertise that's appropriate for that particular assignment.
Absolutely. When somebody is going to receive this appraisal report, what should they expect to be in it? What's going to be contained within this mysterious report?
Well, first off, I will say it should not be 1 page long.
Yes.
My Canadian colleague, Kelly Joas and Darlene Wong, they wrote this great article called Beware the 1-Page Appraisal Report, which I love because every once in a while I happen upon a 1-page appraisal report from back in the day before USPAP was widely introduced. And some people still have that expectation that an appraisal report is a one pager, which it should not be a 1-pager. And also it leads to a lot of misconceptions about how much work is involved in what we do as appraisers. So definitely never have just a 1-page appraisal report, but there are many shared elements that you should look for among an appraisal report prepared by any qualified USPAP compliant appraiser. And the different organizations all have slightly different methodologies and ways at arriving at this final outcome. So the report's format may look slightly different depending on what organization an appraiser was trained in. But one element that should be present in every appraisal is the appraiser's USPAP certification statement, which we've alluded to before, and it's saying that this appraisal is prepared in compliance with USPAP. And I know there are some other elements. Larissa, do you want to chime in on some of the elements you have in your appraisals?
Yes, absolutely. So you're going to want to have at the beginning of the report, you're going to have, and this is going to vary between the different organizations, but you're going to have statements and where you're going to set the scene for what the intended use was for the appraisal. So if it's to get insurance coverage, it's going to state that. And then it's going to say which approach to value was taken in order to get to that value that is going to allow a client to have the coverage that if they need to go out in the marketplace today and replace it, that it's going to be covered. So there's going to be statements about what the intended use is, what the approaches to value are. And this is something that a lot of people get confused on, like how can there be multiple values? And so this is something that I know, Sarah, you've written some great articles that you've got on your website that we can reference that talks about, well, what's the difference between fair market value and what's the difference between insurance value? And so we have to state, what value are we looking for? Because we're going to be looking in very different markets. If you're going to want to go out in a reasonable time frame and replace a piece if it gets damaged or stolen or lost, we're going to be looking to replace that in a retail setting or wherever you shop at the right price for what you can expect to pay. But if you're donating an item, we're going to be looking at a very different value. We're going to be looking at actual sales prices on the secondary market for that type of artwork, because we're looking for, as the IRS states, the price that a piece would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller, both being knowledgeable of the details and neither being under the compulsion to buy or sell. So we're going to be looking at auction results. We are going to be looking in retail in some circumstances, but it's going to be, what is that piece likely to sell for if it were to be sold? What is that value going to be? So typically an insurance value is going to be a lot higher than the fair market value. And that's something that can be a little bit hard to understand, but also hard to swallow, because, if you go to sell a piece, you're not always going to get the price that you paid for it. So I would recommend, we'll put it in the show notes. Sarah's got a really great article on those different approaches to value. So that would be the next thing. That would be one of the most important things that's going to be in that, because that establishes what's going to be there. And then from there, you can determine the scope of work. What does that involve? And so what to you would be involved in the scope of work?
It would include a lot of the details that for the person who this report is prepared for, as they read through it, they can read it and go, oh, I see exactly how this appraiser, what their process was, and some of the similar elements, the approach to value, the level of value, those are folded into my scope of work. And then which markets were considered, what were the conditions of did I inspect the artworks in person? Did I use a black light? Who took the photographs? Those are all details that in my reports I would include in the scope of work. Were there extraordinary assumptions? Were there any hypothetical conditions? And so it's almost like the recipe for the process of what happened in this appraisal. So whether it's your insurance agent or your lawyer or whoever is one of the identified and appropriate intended users, it has that very clear outlining of the relevant key details in the assignment, so people can say, okay, this is exactly what happened. And occasionally I've come across very, very old appraisals written before I was born, where they don't say what level of value, what intended use, what intended users. And my poor client is very, very confused because they have no idea what's going on or how can they use that data. And so the scope of work is something that has evolved over the decades to really protect and serve the client, and so that it's very clearly identified and explained in a way that you don't have to be an appraiser to understand. That's really important, because we want the users of our appraisal services to understand all of the nuances of what we're doing.
Yes, we do. And when people say, oh, how can you possibly come up with a value or a price? That's exactly what outlining, like you said, it's like this recipe, this scope of work. It says, well, here's what we were looking for. Here's how we went about finding that information. And here's how we compiled those results and came up with this number. Because a lot of the times it does seem like we're taking something gray and making it black and white. And you want to be able to follow that logic and go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I feel that this is reasonable. And that's something that's very important, without getting into all the jargon, is being able to understand the logic, and that you feel comfortable that, yes, I can see that this is a process that makes sense.
Yes. And that trust in the appraisal services, and that also the people can feel empowered to take those appraised values and use them for their intended use, which it's always a very important intended use. So as appraisers, we have a lot of responsibility, and I see the scope of work as in addition to what comes later in the body of the report and the comparables, which we'll talk about in a bit. It's showing that process and outlining it so that it's transparent for the people who've engaged us.
Yes, absolutely. And let's just touch a little bit on what is in that mysterious USPAP statement, because it sounds very technical. I know, one thing that's very important, and we spoke about it a little bit, is not having any bias. There'll be a statement in there saying that you have no past, present, or future interest in that object, meaning you didn't sell it to the person, you're not planning on selling it for them, and that none of that occurred within the last 3 years. Like, you did not touch this object and do anything with it in the last 3 years. And this is important because, if you did sell a piece to somebody, then you may feel like, oh gosh, if the value's gone down, I don't really want to tell them the truth. So all of these things make for objectivity, which is the purpose of the appraisal report. And if an appraiser has had a vested interest in a piece that you're looking to get appraised, you may want to find another appraiser. And because I do both, I consult, and so I do broker work and I appraise, but I will never mix the two. So I will always refer an appraisal out if needed, if it's work that I have brokered. That there's little idiosyncrasies, and you want to be really careful that all of these things are being followed so that you're getting an appraisal that is unbiased, that is going to fill your intended use to an adequate level.
Exactly. An appraiser should never be having the appraiser hat and the brokerage hat on at the same time. That is something to run away from if you encounter that as a consumer.
Absolutely, it is. And what else would be in that USPAP statement that would be really important?
I have the no past, present, and future. It identifies which set of USPAP standards, because they change frequently. So that's always great to if somebody's looking at this 6 years from now, it's probably going to be a different version of USPAP. And so it's freezing that at the moment in time so that, someone going back and go, oh, that was when USPAP was this. So it's, again, it's all about the documentation. And then you sign it. And so like I literally sign my USPAP certification. And if it's for a federal purpose, I have to put my EIN tax number in. So we are literally on the hook for these things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why, there's ongoing education and training, and there's very, very thorough training to get to all the different levels of being an appraiser. Being a dealer and understanding the market is one thing, and a lot of dealers will do what will be labeled as appraisal reports, but there's a lot more to it than just understanding the market. There's understanding these different values, and so that's where this rigorous training brings appraisers who are qualified to a very specialized place. So moving on, we've got all of that front matter that goes at the beginning of the appraisal. Then we've got what's known as the body of the report. In here, we've got a number of items that are going to be important to be there. We've got the description. What would you say? There's 16 items that we really need for ISA in the description. Do you guys have a number like that with AAA?
I can't off the top of my head think of the number of them, but the AAA, because I'm a AAA member and an ISA member, in AAA format, our object descriptions are modeled after the Getty Object ID, which is a uniform standard for describing art and artifacts. And so I really like the format that I use because it identifies the artist or maker. It's a full cataloging, their country of origin, the medium that's used in the artwork or the object that's being appraised, the dimensions, the title, if there's a title. Then I actually have an item description field, which has more of a paragraph format narrative describing the item. And back in the day before appraisals had photographs embedded in them, this was really important because before the advent of digital photography, sometimes appraisals didn't always have photographs. So if you see an older appraisal, it may have a very lengthy description because that is the word picture, so to speak. But thankfully now we get to put photographs in our reports, so that's not quite as necessary. And if there's provenance, if the family has provenance or if it was exhibited somewhere, I will always include that in my provenance field. And then extensive pictures. I like to embed a lot of illustrations in my reports so that, say, for a painting, it would be an overall of the painting, a detail of the artist's signature, the verso of the artwork, if that's available to inspect, and then any areas of damage, I'll probably take a picture, a detailed picture of those and illustrate them. So that's the body of, that's just for one item. And then it gets into the comparable analysis. So it depends. Different types of reports have different levels of detail that are needed for comparables. But if it's a report that needs a lot of comparable analysis, I will cite all of the similar artworks that I'm using as comparables, and I will explain why I think they are similar to the appraised item, or why I think they differ in some way, and how that may impact the difference in value. And all of this synthesis then leads me to arrive at my final appraised value, which will be whatever is in the front matter for the level of the market that appraisal is prepared for. And it will be prepared for whatever is the effective date of, the moment in time that these values are relevant for. And that's going to be in the front matter of the appraisal report too. So often for insurance, it's the day I'm there inspecting the artworks, because I can say, they look like this on this day. If it's for a damage situation, it might be the day of damage. If it's for an estate situation, it may be the date of death. So that's something that's very specific to every assignment, and that'll be up in the front matter. But the values in the body are all generated relative to that effective date.
Yes, the effective date. It is definitely an important factor, and I like that description of comparing, taking the comparable works and the intended use. So this is a real synthesis of how we come up with the values. It's how everything's spelled out, from the description of the work to how it relates to the market, to how that piece compares to other pieces that have sold or are for sale. And so this is where we turn the grey into black and white.
And we explain how we're doing it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it should make sense when you get an appraisal. You should be able to read it and go, yes, I follow the logic here. I can see that this makes sense, and this is the most probable value for the intended use. So then, after the body of the appraisal, we come to the stuff at the end, whether you call it, an addendum, or you have some additional photos. Again, this is going to look a little different between the different appraisal societies, but one thing that I know you and I both have at the end of each appraisal is a glossary.
A lot of the words we use in our field can be a little obscure for people who don't live and breathe art appraising. And so going in that same theme of having our appraisal reports be very transparent and understandable to a generalist audience, people who may not be art appraisers, I like to have a glossary at the back of my reports that has definitions for some of these more arcane terms. So if you're reading through and you're going, what is this word? You can flip to the back and here it is, it's outlined. And then something else that, and some appraisers have this in the back, some appraisers have this earlier in their front matter, somewhere within that report should be the CV with the qualifications for the appraiser, so that anyone reading it who is an intended user asking the question, well, why was this appraiser qualified to do this appraisal? That should answer it. That should be, the training, the education, the specialized experience that appraiser has that makes them a qualified expert, who is competent to do that appraisal report. So somewhere in the report should be that appraiser's qualification CV.
Yes, absolutely. And like we said, with the differences between the different organizations, you may find that at the front, you may find it in the back, but make sure it's there. Something else that I might have are additional photographs, so that the body of the appraisal isn't crammed up with many photographs. I'll often have just the one key piece in the body. And then at the end, I'll have the close-ups of the signature, pictures of the back, labels, anything that might need to be supporting visual evidence for what is needed in that appraisal.
I also like to have a section where it's a works cited. So the different websites I consulted, the databases I consulted, if there were reference books I consulted, I'll add those in. So again, giving people a roadmap and a recipe for this was where the appraiser went and what they did to arrive at their conclusions.
Yes, it's almost like a mini thesis on your art collection here.
It is. It's like writing a term paper.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot that goes into writing a qualified appraisal report. And this gives you a picture of the detail and the depth that should be going into it. And we're going to put a bunch of resources at the end if you want to read further on any of these topics, because this was a really sort of brief overview to give a big picture, but each of these points that we've spoken about goes a lot deeper, and there are a lot of things that we didn't get to touch on because it does get a little bit heavy. But our intention here was to give you a picture of what you should expect if you are told that you need to go and get an appraisal report for your art collection. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today, Sarah. I really appreciate your eloquence and ability to explain things to our audience.
Thank you, Larissa. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on the Art Elevator today. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. If you found this podcast to be super helpful, please leave a review to spread the word. If you'd love to hear about something else, let me know too. In the show notes below, you will find links mentioned in the interview, plus a link to receive an actionable checklist where you can start applying what you've learned here today. Here's to elevating your life with art.